Witness to Injustice, a Courtroom Chronicle. I remember the day clearly, the cold, steel-blue morning in a sprawling metropolis, one of America's great cities where skyscrapers cast long shadows over neighborhoods steeped in history. The air was thick with the promise of change as I navigated the bustling streets, where the staccato rhythm of hurried footsteps intertwined with the distant hum of city life. Each towering building stood as a testament to ambition, yet beneath their gleaming facades lay stories of struggle and resilience, whispered only to those who cared to listen. On that day, as I approached the courthouse, I felt a tension in the air, a palpable anticipation of the unfolding drama that would not only challenge the very fabric of our legal system, but would also awaken a deep-seated urgency within me. The stark contrast of the cold, early light against the warmth of human emotion set the stage for what was to come, a confrontation between justice and injustice that would echo long after the gavel fell. As I stepped up the courthouse steps, each one seemed to resonate with the weight of countless decisions made within those walls. Presidential orders, landmark rulings, and the quieter human stories of justice and despair. Inside, the heavy wooden doors creaked open, revealing the grandiose interior adorned with marble columns and ornate ceiling paintings. The chill from outside was replaced by a warm, charged atmosphere, where anticipation hung in the air like a thick fog. People milled about, their voices a mix of anxious murmurs and fervent conversations. Journalists clustered in groups, adjusting cameras and microphones, while lawyers exchanged calculated glances, their expressions masking the urgency of the moment. As I took my seat in the back of the courtroom, I caught sight of the primary figures involved. The prosecutor, a seasoned attorney with a reputation for relentless pursuit of justice, stood poised and ready. Opposite her was the defense lawyer, a sharp-minded strategist known for turning the tide in desperate situations. Each side was preparing for a battle that encompassed more than just legal arguments. It was a clash of ideologies, a fight for what was right against what was easy. And there I sat, a witness to history in the making. The judge entered, an imposing figure whose presence brought immediate silence. With a slight nod, she acknowledged the court with authority and grace, her gavel poised to initiate proceedings. As she swept her gaze across the room, I felt her keen understanding of the stakes at play. The lives affected by this case were not mere statistics. They were real people with hopes, fears, and dreams. Her voice rang out, sharp and clear, cutting through the tension. The opening statements began, and I was captivated. Each word was laden with anticipation as the prosecutor painted a vivid picture of the events leading to this moment. How a single act had spiraled into chaos, affecting a community in ways no one could have predicted. The defense was quick to counter, launching into an eloquent narrative that sought to unravel the prosecution's claims. My heart raced with each argument delivered. It wasn't just a fight for one individual's fate. It was a reflection of society's struggles, inequality, prejudice, and the relentless pursuit of truth amidst a sea of bias. As the hours ticked by, I felt my own resolve strengthen. I had come here as a bystander, yet I was leaving with an unmistakable sense of duty. This was a pivotal moment that could reshape perceptions, ignite movements, swaying public opinion to reconsider an issue that had long lingered in the shadows. The jurors, seated with expressions of somber focus, were tasked with deciding the fate of not just one person, but of beliefs that affected countless lives. Throughout the trial, I found my mind wandering, reflecting on stories that resonated with my own experiences, tales of personal trials and triumphs that mirrored the proceedings. I started to recognize the interconnectedness of our struggles, how the courtroom drama unfolded against a backdrop of societal change that felt both urgent and necessary. It became apparent that I could no longer sit idly by. I had to lend my voice to the conversation, to fight for justice not just in this courtroom, but in every aspect of life, however small. As the gavel finally struck, signaling the day's close, I knew this was only the beginning. I stepped out into the streets feeling empowered by a newfound purpose. The city, with its towering structures and busy inhabitants, was a canvas of potential. And as I walked along the bustling thoroughfare, I understood that this day, this moment, would resonate far beyond the courthouse. It would ripple through the very fabric of our society, igniting fires of change that could not be extinguished. I was there as an eyewitness, An ordinary citizen drawn unwillingly into the extraordinary unfolding of events that would expose the deep-rooted prejudice underpinning our judicial system. My recollection is not merely a testimony, it is a wake-up call to the injustice that persists even in this modern era. Despite stringent anti-discrimination laws such as the Civil Rights Act and a growing public demand for equality. As I stood among the crowd outside the courthouse, I could feel the heavy weight of anticipation mixed with anxiety in the air. Voices erupted in protest, a cacophony of calls for justice and integrity that echoed against the stone walls of an institution meant to uphold the very ideals we were fighting for. People of different ages, races, and backgrounds had gathered, united by a common cause, to demand accountability from a system that had betrayed their trust time and again. The trial before us was emblematic of a broader struggle, encapsulating the frustrations of those who had long suffered in silence. In my role as an unnoticed observer, I realized that my own life experiences were intertwined with the stories being shared around me. Friends and family members openly recounted their run-ins with prejudiced rulings and biased juries, each narrative a painful reminder of the scars that social injustice leaves behind. It was as though each individual was adding a brushstroke to a poignant mural of suffering and resilience, each account bringing us one step closer to unveiling the truth. As the days of the trial unfolded, every testimony revealed the layers of discrimination that had been woven into the fabric of our justice system. The stark contrast between the privileges afforded to some and the systemic barriers faced by others were laid bare under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtrooms. Witness after witness took the stand, their voices a symphony of truth that resonated in the hearts of many, offering a collective catharsis we so desperately needed. The media's coverage brought the conversation into living rooms across the nation, prompting debates that traversed race, gender, and socioeconomic status. Online forums buzzed with dialogues that mirrored the discussions I overheard outside the courthouse walls. It was a reckoning, a moment of awakening that echoed through social media, hashtags, and rallies where people proclaimed, "Enough is enough." This movement, fueled by passion and purpose, became an unstoppable force, challenging the status quo and calling for a comprehensive reevaluation of our legal structures. It ignited a sense of urgency in policymakers, activists, and ordinary citizens alike, each echoing the sentiment that we could no longer afford to turn a blind eye to inequality. The conversations did not end at the courthouse. They spread to schools, workplaces, and community centers, emphasizing the importance of education in dismantling prejudice at its roots. As I reflect on those days, I cherish the profound sense of solidarity that permeated every demonstration and keynote speech. Each individual, no matter how seemingly insignificant, played a pivotal role in piecing together a narrative that the system could no longer ignore. This was not simply a trial, it was a movement, a call to action that urged us to confront the brutal realities of our world and to strive for a better future. One where justice was not merely a privilege for the few, but a right guaranteed to all. Ultimately, we recognize that true change requires more than just awareness. It embodies a relentless commitment to advocacy and reform, ensuring that the legacy of those who suffered would not be in vain. Together, we pledge to keep the conversation alive and to hold our institutions accountable. My experience as an eyewitness had transformed me into a voice for the voiceless, and in that profound shift, I discovered not only my purpose, but also the undeniable power that lies in collective action. The case had begun like any other, with a sense of routine predictability in the air, but it soon revealed itself as a microcosm of a widespread societal malaise that plagued our communities. At the heart of this unfolding drama was the accused, a Black man named Marcus Jefferson, who found himself thrust into the harsh spotlight of public scrutiny. His name, his face, and even the details of his background, everything about him had become fodder for a narrative that had already begun to spiral out of his control before the first gavel had even fallen. Marcus was not just a statistic or a headline. He was a dedicated, hardworking citizen, a proud father of two spirited children, and an active community volunteer who poured his energy into local initiatives aimed at uplifting those around him. His life was as ordinary as any other, filled with the daily triumphs and struggles that characterize the experience of so many. Yet as I sat in the courtroom that day, I witnessed the machinery of injustice in action, a deliberate skewing of facts crafted meticulously to fit a preconceived notion of guilt that was disturbingly fueled by racial prejudice. The narrative being shaped around Marcus was not one born out of concrete evidence. Rather, it was a concoction of biases and stereotypes that sought to define him solely by the color of his skin, stripping away his identity and humanity in the process. This realization pierced my heart, igniting a fire within me to fight against the misconceptions that had entangled him, and to advocate not only for him, but for countless others caught in a similar tumult. As I leaned forward in my seat, the tension in the room thickened, a palpable reminder of the stakes involved. The charges against Marcus were serious, assault and theft, but the evidence presented was flimsy at best, resting primarily on eyewitness accounts marred by uncertainty and prejudice. My thoughts drifted to the numerous times I had watched similar stories unfold, echoing the troubling patterns of a justice system that often seemed more concerned with maintaining appearances than with uncovering the truth. It wasn't just Marcus on trial, it was an entire community facing the judgment of an uninformed public, eager to consume a narrative that confirmed their biases. I observed the faces of the jurors, their expressions fluctuating between skepticism and acceptance, reflecting the wider societal attitudes towards race and criminality. An uncomfortable silence enveloped the courtroom when the prosecution presented their case, laden with implications that Marcus was a product of his environment, as if poverty and systemic inequities were a prerequisite for crime. My thoughts turned to his children, two bright-eyed kids who looked up to their father with admiration and love. I could only imagine the confusion and heartbreak they experienced as they watched their dad, a man they knew to be kind and generous, painted as a villain. It was then that I felt a profound sense of responsibility wash over me. I wasn't just a spectator in this drama. I had to become a voice for the voiceless, a beacon of hope for those who had been sidelined by a narrative scripted by fear and misunderstanding. During the recess, I found myself speaking with other advocates who had come to support Marcus. There was a palpable sense of camaraderie among us, an unspoken understanding that the fight for justice extended beyond this single case. We shared stories of similar battles fought, of lives disrupted and identities tangled in the web of systemic racism. The resilience of the community shone through our discussions, igniting ideas for mobilization, for outreach, for education. It became clear that while Marcus was at the center of this whirlwind, his plight was connected to a larger movement striving for equity and recognition. As the trial resumed, I resolved to take notes not just on the proceedings, but also on the underlying themes that emerged, the implicit biases, the narratives spun from half-truths, and the heroic efforts of those who stood firm in the face of adversity. Each testimony became a thread, weaving a fabric of collective resistance that demanded to be seen and heard. I envisioned a future where stories like Marcus's weren't just case files, but catalysts for change, educating a misinformed society about the realities of race and justice. By the day's end, as the courtroom lights dimmed, I felt an unwavering sense of purpose. The fight for Marcus was part of a broader struggle, one that sought not just exoneration for him, but a re-examination of the systems that had wronged so many. I left the courtroom not only as an advocate, but as an ally in the long journey toward justice, knowing that with every step, we could dismantle the barriers that perpetuated misunderstanding and discrimination. The battle was far from over, but together we would strive to ensure that truth, transparency, and humanity prevailed. It all began on a seemingly typical afternoon, the sun casting a warm glow over the vibrant uptown district, which was usually alive with the sounds of laughter and the aroma of street food. However, this day would take an unforeseen turn as tensions within the community ignited. A misunderstanding between neighbors, stoked by long-standing grievances and cultural tensions, escalated into chaos. What began as a simple dispute over noise complaints quickly spiraled out of control, a small fire fanned by the breath of sensational media headlines that seized the opportunity to frame the incident as something much more sinister. The police were called in with alarming speed, sirens echoing down the streets, breaking the afternoon's peaceful facade. As officers rushed in, a flurry of rapid arrests and hurried statements filled the air, each action stirring an already volatile situation into a tempest. At the eye of this storm stood Marcus, an unsuspecting resident with no connection to the unfolding drama, but who found himself ensnared in the chaos of miscommunication and misrepresentation. In the days that followed, rumors and urban legends about criminality and unruly behavior, narratives long associated with Black communities, began to color the public's perception of the incident from the very start. Social media erupted with speculation, creating a frenzy that distorted reality with each click and share. The narrative, driven by stereotypes and historical prejudices, painted a picture far removed from the truth, as identities were formed and judgments passed before any facts could emerge. Marcus, like so many others before him, became a casualty of a justice system tainted by bias and a media lens that prioritized sensationalism over accuracy. In the courtroom, the prosecutor, Mr. Roland Pierce, a man with an impressive resume and a verdict-driven approach that often overshadowed the complexities of human behavior, presented a case that was, unsettlingly, more a performance than a pursuit of truth. His strategy hinged on circumstantial evidence and a series of unfounded assumptions, all crafted to manipulate the perception of the jury rather than provide clarity about the events that led to Marcus's arrest. As he stood before the bench, his commanding presence filled the room, and his opening statement was a careful blend of cold statistics and veiled insinuations, skillfully designed to evoke fear and doubt. He cited notorious neighborhoods with a flair for drama, implying an unspoken narrative of danger that had followed Marcus like a dark cloud, feeding the prejudices that often lay dormant in the minds of those unacquainted with the truth. The language he employed was ruthlessly forceful, each syllable meticulously constructed to reinforce the notion that Marcus's race rendered him inherently suspicious, a notion steeped in the systemic bias, yet cloaked in the guise of rationality. It was as if Mr. Pierce had rehearsed not just the facts of the case, but the familiar rhythms of a narrative that had been played out countless times before in courtrooms across the country. Despite the existence of anti-discrimination legislation meant to protect individuals like Marcus from the corrosive effects of such bias, the prejudice was palpable, seeping into every word of the accusation like poison in a well. The jury, swayed by the emotive power of his oratory, seemed to lean in, as if drawn by an invisible thread woven from societal fears and long-held stereotypes. The atmosphere crackled with tension, revealing the stark reality that, even in the pursuit of justice, the specter of discrimination could overshadow the very principles meant to uphold equality and fairness. Across the aisle, Marcus sat nervously, a stark contrast to the imposing figure of Mr. Pierce. His defense attorney, Ms. Elena Carter, was a woman with a quiet determination that masked the weight of her task. A public defender by vocation, she had spent countless hours poring over the evidence, meticulously dissecting each piece to construct a narrative that could counter the onslaught that was being unleashed against her client. She was aware that she was up against not just the prosecution, but also the deeply ingrained biases that often lulled the scales of justice into an uncomfortable imbalance. As Ms. Carter rose to address the jury, she adopted a different approach, one that was grounded in humanity rather than theatrics. She began with a story, recounting Marcus's life as a devoted father striving to carve out a path for his young daughter. "He is not merely a name on a docket," she implored, her voice steady yet laced with emotion. "He is a person, a man with hopes, dreams, and a family who relies on him." The jury, who had been seduced by the rhetoric of danger, began to shift in their seats, grappling with the duality of fear and empathy that hung heavily in the air. As she continued, Ms. Carter drew their attention to the timelines and inconsistencies in the prosecution's case, illuminating the shadows in Mr. Pierce's arguments with the light of careful analysis. She referred to alibis, witnesses who could vouch for Marcus's whereabouts, and a lack of concrete evidence that could link him to the crime scene beyond mere association. Each point was a gentle push against the wall of prejudice that had been built around the narrative, and she encouraged the jurors to see Marcus as more than an abstract representation of bias, but as an individual who deserved understanding. With each word, she dismantled the notion that race alone could define a man's character. The room felt charged with a new energy, as if the very air vibrated with the potential for change. Murmurs rippled through the jury box, and it was evident that Mrs. Carter's authenticity was having an impact, a breakthrough against the emotional artillery that Mr. Pierce had unleashed. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath, caught in a moment where the possibility of justice flickered like a candle in the dark, courageously defying the gusts of prejudice and fear. By the time she concluded her statement, urging the jury to rise above preconceived notions and to judge Marcus not for the color of his skin, but for his actions and his truth, a collective resolve had begun to form. The atmosphere shifted into a potential hushed reverence. As the jurors exchanged glances that spoke of contemplation, their expressions revealing an internal struggle between the weight of societal influence and the ideals of justice they were meant to uphold. They had come seeking a resolution, but perhaps now they found themselves contemplating a deeper question. What does it mean to truly seek justice in a world laced with bias? As the proceedings continued, it was clear that the matter at hand reached far beyond Marcus's fate. It was a testament to the flaws in a system that was still grappling with its own reflections. A chance for justice to be defined not by the echoes of prejudice, but by the genuine pursuit of truth, empathy, and understanding. My mind raced through the myriad ways in which bias infiltrated the judicial process, threatening to transform a search for justice into a perilous game of chess where the pawns were real lives. I wondered how many lawyers had approached the case with a predetermined narrative, allowing their preconceptions to overshadow the facts. The ones wearing their biases like badges of honor were assuredly blind to the sacrifices made on behalf of those whose only crime was existing within preordained societal constructs. As the judge periodically glanced over their spectacles, an imposing figure of authority, I pondered whether they were fully aware of the prevailing winds of discrimination swirling just beneath the surface of their courtroom. Each ruling, every nod, seemed to reverberate with an unspoken bias tinged with the ghosts of past injustices, reminding me that the law often appeared more like a set of loose guidelines rather than the unyielding fortress of fairness it professed to be. The defendant, sitting stoically, seemed to embody the emotional weight of an entire community, and every man caught in the complex web of systemic inequality. I felt a deep urge to understand their story, the motivations and struggles that had led them to this point. What hopes had been dashed upon the altar of prejudice? What dreams had been prematurely extinguished by the climate of fear that lingered in the air like an uninvited guest? The prosecution spoke with fervor, wielding words like weapons, crafting an illusion of truth adorned with half-told tales and exaggerated claims. They painted a portrait that saw the defendant not as a person, but as a caricature, an embodiment of all that society had deemed suspect or threatening. The juxtaposition of narratives, the prosecutor's hawkish rhetoric versus the defense's calls for humanity, deepened my sense of disquiet. As the jury listened intently, I could see the subtle shifts of their expressions, the flicker of doubt, the moment of empathy. Or was it indifference? Faced with the gravity of the human experience before them, how would they reconcile their own biases with the pressing demand for justice? It was all too surreal. Outside those walls, the world spun on, with families anxiously waiting for outcomes that would resonate far beyond this courtroom. Would a single verdict alter the course of their lives forever? Or would it be just another page in a history book filled with accounts of misunderstood justice? The intricate dance of power, race, and respect played out in each fold of the courtroom's fabric, and I remained anchored to my seat, a silent witness to the unfolding complexities of human nature. Each heartbeat echoing the silent cries for equity and truth in a place where the scales of justice sometimes felt irrevocably tipped. The victim in the case, a middle-aged businessman, took to the witness stand with an air of unwavering confidence that enveloped the courtroom in a palpable silence, almost reverent in its intensity. Yet beneath the surface of his polished composure, there lay a troubling absence of critical details that hinted at a deeper narrative obscured by prejudice and broad-brush assumptions. His recollection of events, while assertive, was clouded by long-held stereotypes that not only skewed his perspective, but also revealed a thinly veiled fear of the unknown, fear rooted in societal norms that perpetuate division and distrust among different communities. The trial documentation had established that Marcus's arrest was precipitated by a tragic misunderstanding of his seemingly innocuous actions, a misreading that ignited the flames of suspicion. However, these essential nuances were swiftly overshadowed by a relentless barrage of prejudiced insinuations that painted him in shades of culpability purely based on his ethnicity. Each twist of the original accusation served as stark evidence of a societal narrative that had already rendered a verdict long before the case came to light. A narrative that condemned Marcus not for his actions, but for the color of his skin, leaving me with the haunting realization of how easily lives can be irrevocably altered by assumptions and fear. In the days that followed, as the trial progressed, the courtroom atmosphere morphed into a charged battleground, barely concealing the undercurrents of tension swirling around every corner. Jurors exchanged furtive glances, their faces etched with uncertainty, as if they were acutely aware of the narratives attempting to shape their judgments. Each new witness brought forth was not merely a voice in the proceedings, they were glaring reminders of the city's deep-seated biases, their testimonies steeped in prejudice and illuminating the fundamental imbalance that permeated every aspect of the trial. The defense team, led by the astute and tenacious young attorney named Sarah, sought to unravel this intricate web of prejudice that ensnared her client, Marcus. With each question she posed, it became increasingly clear that the prosecution's case was fragile, built upon a foundation of assumptions masquerading as evidence. Biases rooted not in reality, but in societal stereotypes. Sarah's approach was passionate and methodical. She dissected the prosecution's arguments like a skilled surgeon, revealing the gaping holes and inconsistencies hidden beneath layers of misperception and fear. It was a battle not just for Marcus's freedom, but for the reinterpretation of a narrative that had long been written in ink stained by injustice. Sarah's strategy was not merely to defend her client, but to launch a full frontal assault on the very foundations of the prejudiced perceptions that had unjustly led to his wrongful detention. With meticulous precision, she introduced a trove of evidence that did far more than speak to Marcus's innocence. It laid bare the essence of who he was as a person. She presented heartfelt testimonials from a diverse group of community members, neighbors, teachers, and even local business owners, who spoke of his unwavering generosity, kindness, and deep commitment to uplifting local initiatives. They recounted stories of Marcus volunteering at youth centers, organizing neighborhood cleanup events, and mentoring at-risk teenagers, painting a rich tapestry of a man dedicated to making his community a better place. This kaleidoscopic view of Marcus's character stood in stark contrast to the one-dimensional narrative spun by the prosecution, which sought to define him merely by the circumstances of his alleged crime. Yet despite Sarah's impassioned efforts to humanize him and shift the jury's perspective, a palpable chill hung in the air. The jury sat cold and unmoved, their faces inscrutable, as though they were encased in a fortress of preconceived notions that refused to be breached. As the final arguments loomed, Sarah delivered a passionate plea that lingered in the air, electrifying the room with her fervor. "We are not simply here to seek justice for Marcus," she declared, her voice steady, "but to confront the deeply rooted biases that have led us to this moment. We must ask ourselves how many innocent lives are impacted by our collective fears." The words resonated, momentarily cutting through the haze of prejudice that cloaked the courtroom, creating a moment of reflection for those present. Following the trial, community members began to gather outside the courthouse, voices rising in protest against systemic inequality. They held placards that read, "Justice for Marcus and no more assumptions." In an unexpected twist, the public outcry seemed to awaken a conscience within many jurors, prompting discussions that extended beyond the confines of the case at hand. Journalists and activists alike seized upon the unfolding narrative, highlighting the intersections of race, justice, and societal responsibility. As the jury's deliberation drew on, the pressure mounted, and the weight of the entire community seemed to rest on their shoulders. For Marcus, who sat anxiously awaiting the outcome, the trial had transformed from a simple legal battle into a pivotal moment for change. He had unknowingly become a symbol of resilience against prejudice, drawing attention to the urgent need for reform in the justice system. The ripple effect of his case was felt far beyond the courtroom, catalyzing a movement towards a more inclusive dialogue about race and justice. Ultimately, when the jury's verdict was announced, it reverberated through the hearts of many, a sigh of relief mixed with an underlying sense of frustration, a recognition that the fight was far from over. Though Marcus was acquitted, the experience left an indelible mark on the community, igniting conversations that had long been dormant, revealing the fragility of justice in the face of prejudice. During a break in the proceedings, I took the opportunity to engage with several day-to-day observers and local community members gathered in the courtroom's hushed corridors. Their eyes, filled with a palpable sorrow and disbelief, bore witness to a shared history marked by injustice. As they recounted their experiences, a tapestry of narratives unfolded, each tale steeped in the weight of prejudice, echoing a litany of injustices where the scales of justice often tipped perilously. They spoke of moments when justice was obscured by relentless assumptions and half-truths, where the mere color of one's skin or the neighborhood one hailed from could dictate the course of one's life. Although there existed legal safeguards intended to prevent such blatant discrimination, the reality was far more insidious. The law was there on paper, offering a semblance of protection, yet the human element, pervasive bias and deep-seated stereotypes, diluted those protections, turning them into mere tokens of hope that often failed to manifest in real-world outcomes. In their voices, I could hear the tremors of frustration and despair, as they described instances where the enforcement of these laws seemed to evaporate in the face of personal prejudice. Each story was a reminder that while the legal framework might advocate for equality, it was the lived experiences of individuals that illustrated the stark contrast between justice as an ideal and justice as a reality. The accusations against Marcus were thus laid out in three parts. First, that he had incited a disturbance in a sensitive neighborhood, a term that itself carried a weight of implication about the type of existing residents and their perceptions. Second, that he had engaged in behavior unbecoming a citizen, an ambiguous phrase that could easily be skewed to fit racial stereotypes rather than align with any objective standard of conduct. And third, that his mere presence during the incident somehow validated his guilt, as if being in the wrong place at the wrong time was enough to tarnish his character irreparably. These assertions were presented as undeniable facts rather than as potential misinterpretations fueled by societal prejudice, reduced to simplistic narratives that ignored the complexities of his situation. Throughout the testimony, a pattern emerged, a systematic neglect of context, character, and the realities of systemic racism. It became painfully clear that Marcus was being tried not solely for the alleged misdeeds, but for his very identity as a black man. Each claim against him seemed not just to rest on his actions, but rather on an insidious idea that his race alone was a marker of suspicion. In a world where skin color often dictated one's fate, the courtroom became a stage where the biases of society played out, overshadowing any semblance of justice and fairness. Even the legal experts in the courtroom could not ignore the undercurrents of prejudice that ran through the case files, like an invisible thread weaving through the fabric of justice. It was as if every argument was tinged with the residue of societal biases, and each witness, no matter how credible, bore the weight of their identity in a world that weighed individuals on an unjust scale. A particularly striking moment came when a defense attorney, fueled by a desperate hope for fairness, boldly challenged a piece of evidence that had been presented with questionable integrity. However, instead of engaging in a meaningful dialogue about the merits of the evidence, the presiding judge dismissed the attorney with a wave of condescension, uttering remarks that dripped with sarcasm and superiority. Those words echoed in my mind, lingering like a bitter aftertaste, a stark reminder of an old order where the hierarchies of race and power dynamics trumped the noble pursuit of truth and justice. It was a disheartening revelation, illuminating how judicial procedures, which were meant to be the sanctuaries of impartiality, could devolve into arenas where racial bias reigned supreme. This harsh reality painted a somber picture of a supposed bastion of fairness, exposing the cracks in a system that was, in theory, designed to protect the innocent but often faltered under the weight of prejudice. The accusations were not confined to mere words. They had the power to dictate outcomes and lives, casting long shadows over the future of those entangled in the process. I could see in Marcus's eyes a tumultuous mixture of bewilderment and resignation, his expression a reflection of recurring fears that society often relegated to the background, an unspoken acknowledgement of how the system could be manipulated. It became painfully clear that the trial was less about the facts and more about a verdict predetermined by deep-seated prejudices that lingered like ghosts from history, haunting not just the case at hand, but the very fabric of justice itself. As I observed this chilling spectacle unfold, I vowed internally that the injustice being perpetrated that day would resonate far beyond the courtroom walls. It would serve as both a cautionary tale about the fragility of fairness and a decisive moment for social reflection, igniting the collective consciousness to challenge the status quo. In that instant, I understood the weight of responsibility resting on my shoulders, not just as a bystander, but as a participant in a society that needed to confront its uncomfortable truths and strive for true equity. There was a flicker of resolve igniting within me, a determination that transcended the immediate scene. I began to envision how I could channel this moment of despair into something that might resonate with the public, to turn the palpable tension in the room into a catalyst for change. I thought of the voices that had been silenced, the stories that had been buried beneath the weight of prejudice, and how critical it was to amplify them. I couldn't sit idly by. I needed to document this trial not just as an account of legal proceedings, but as an expose of the societal flaws that had led us here. My mind raced with ideas for a compelling narrative, one that captured the essence of what was at stake: human dignity, justice, and the relentless pursuit of truth. I resolved to speak with the friends and family of those affected, to gather their perspectives and weave them into a broader tapestry of suffering and resilience. There was power in their stories, a raw authenticity that could stir the hearts of those who had grown complacent in their understanding of justice. Even as the gavel came down, rendering a verdict that seemed utterly unjust, I sensed that this was not the end. It was merely a chapter in a larger fight, a struggle that spanned generations. I envisioned campaigns, vigils, and gatherings where we would not only grieve, but also rally, standing shoulder to shoulder against a system designed to silence us. Social media platforms would buzz with our narratives as hashtags emerged and transformed into movements, drawing in supporters from across the globe. In my heart, I knew that real change would demand more than just awareness. It would require action, unity, and relentless perseverance. There would be obstacles, no doubt, from the entrenched powers willing to sidestep accountability. But within the collective grief of this moment lay the seeds of courage, the willingness of ordinary people to rise up and demand better. I felt the weight of the journey ahead, but alongside it, the exhilarating spark of possibility. This trial would not mark the end of Marcus's fight. It would become a turning point for many, a resolute call to arms in the ongoing pursuit of justice and equality. As I left the courtroom, my thoughts turned to the broader implications of what had transpired. Would this serve as a wake-up call for those who had long turned a blind eye? I hoped that the whispers of discontent would grow into a roar, that our society would confront the uncomfortable truths and errant narratives that shape perceptions of justice. Perhaps, just perhaps, the injustice that unfolded today could catalyze a cultural shift, challenging the very foundations of our preconceived notions and empowering a new generation to advocate for those still silenced by systemic barriers. The trial was set in a stately yet imposing courthouse nestled in the heart of a modern metropolis, a structure that echoed the weight of centuries of legal history. Its marble floors, polished to a reflective sheen, stretched out beneath grand columns that soared towards high ceilings, adorned with intricate moldings and murals depicting allegorical figures of justice. The solemn portraits of previous legal luminaries lined the walls, their gazes seemingly scrutinizing the proceedings, clearly contrasting with the contentious atmosphere that enveloped the courtroom that day. The air was thick with tension, as the audience, a mix of supporters, skeptics, and curious onlookers, absorbed the unfolding drama with bated breath. As the case unfolded, the narrative of Marcus's supposed criminality was not simply presented as a set of facts. It was methodically deconstructed and reassembled to suit a biased agenda, a choreographed performance by those wielding the law as both a sword and a shield. Each piece of circumstantial evidence was examined and recast in a light that cast Marcus not as a victim of circumstance, but as a villain in a tale spun from fear and misunderstanding. I was there at every turn, not merely an observer, but a witness to the intricate interplay of legal maneuvers, the strategic planting of doubt, and the subtle yet undeniable unspoken language of prejudice that colored every exchange. The whispers of bias were almost palpable, swirling around the courtroom like a dark cloud, serving as a stark reminder that behind every charge, there exists a complex tapestry of human emotions, societal biases, and the relentless struggle for truth amidst the cacophony of perception. During the trial, the prosecution's strategy was to construct a seemingly airtight case by intricately weaving together circumstantial evidence, highlighting minor inaccuracies, and, most critically, exploiting deeply ingrained preconceptions held by the jury. Mr. Pierce, the prosecutor, was a polished orator, renowned for his impressive courtroom presence and his uncanny ability to manipulate facts, bending them to fit a carefully curated narrative designed to elicit strong emotional reactions. His language, rich with suggestive nuances and charged implications, often painted Marcus in a deliberately unflattering light, portraying him as a dangerous outsider. This portrayal suggested that his very existence, coupled with his cultural background, cast a long shadow over his actions, casting doubt on his intentions and insinuating that they were reflexively criminal. As Mr. Pierce delivered his arguments, a palpable tension filled the room. The air crackled with the weight of his implications, as if the very essence of justice was being held in a precarious balance on the edge of bias. Testimonies were undeniably the backbone of the trial, serving as the crucial thread woven through the intricate tapestry of the case. Various witnesses were called to the stand, some of whom had direct ties to the incident, their connections laden with personal stakes and emotional burdens, while others seemed to be mere bystanders, inadvertently swept into the maelstrom of scrutiny surrounding the courtroom drama. As I listened intently to each account, a sense of unease began to settle over me, like a heavy fog cloaking the truth. It was disquieting to observe how some witnesses appeared almost reluctant to share their truth, their voices barely rising above a whisper, betraying a profound inner turmoil. Their eyes darted nervously around the courtroom, as if searching for an escape from the weight of their words, haunted by the implications of their testimonies. The palpable tension was intensified by the austere gaze of the judge and the scrutinizing stares from jurors, which seemed to linger like shadows, amplifying the pressure to conform to the narrative expected of them. Each pause in their testimonies felt like a gaping chasm of uncertainty, underscoring a chilling reality. Here, in this room filled with the echoes of justice, was the suffocating fear of backlash and misjudgment, a reminder of the immense power that rested in the hands of those determining the fate of the accused. It became increasingly apparent that many of these individuals had been subtly coerced, whether through the insidious pressures of societal expectations or the intimidating atmosphere of the proceedings that loomed over them like a dark cloud. They found themselves not merely recounting their experiences, but echoing long-standing stereotypes, giving life to exaggerated details that they might have otherwise brushed aside as trivial in the light of day. This phenomenon was not merely a reflection of their personal biases. It was emblematic of a broader, systemic issue, one that has long been entrenched in a foundation of preconceived notions, where the undercurrents of historical injustices mingled with contemporary realities. With each hesitant word they breathed into the air, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were not just testifying about what they witnessed. They were, in a sense, unwitting participants in a larger performance. They were inadvertently reinforcing narratives meticulously cultivated over the years, narratives that, like shadows, stretched far beyond the courtroom's walls and carried immense implications, not just for the fate of the accused, but for the very bedrock of what we consider justice in society. The weight of their testimony felt heavier still, because it seemed to suggest that the very system designed to uphold truth was instead perpetuating a cycle of misunderstanding and bias that would ripple through the community they called home. One key witness, Mr. Harold Simmons, a retired policeman known for his staunch traditional views, took the stand with an air of gravitas that seemed to demand attention. He described the events of that fateful day with an uncharacteristic certainty that belied the complex realities of the situation. His testimony, while delivered in a calm, almost rehearsed tone, was layered with a disturbing undertone that echoed the biases he likely held throughout his career. As he spoke, it became evident that his narrative enforced the popular belief that Black men were predisposed toward violence, a deeply troubling claim that had little to do with Marcus's own actions and instead appeared to be a reflection of Simmons's own preconceived notions and stereotypes. Moreover, it was as if Simmons was casting a long shadow over the entire courtroom, a figurative fog that obscured clarity and reason. His words, laden with historical prejudice, reinforced age-old biases that many in the room hoped were being dismantled. The subtleties of his language, carefully chosen yet insidiously charged, coupled with the confident mien he projected, subtly shifted the focus away from the specifics of Marcus's case. Instead, the discourse veered toward a broader, more ominous narrative that perpetuated fear and misunderstanding of an entire demographic. His assertions, often presented with the authority of someone who had worn a badge, seemed to resonate unsettlingly with a contingent of jurors. These jurors, whether consciously or subconsciously, appeared to be swayed by Simmons's commanding presence, allowing themselves to buy into the prejudiced framing of the situation, despite the glaring lack of factual backing for his claims. In doing so, Simmons not only misrepresented the events surrounding Marcus's case, but also indirectly endorsed a worldview that painted the defendant as guilty based solely on the color of his skin. This moment served as a stark reminder of how deeply entrenched these cultural biases can be, woven into the very fabric of institutions that are sworn to uphold justice. The implications of his testimony extended beyond the courtroom, as it echoed the societal struggles against systemic racism, underscoring the urgent need for introspection and reform within judicial practices. Amid the testimonies, I noted a palpable tension. The courtroom was not merely discussing one man's actions. It was, in effect, rehashing an entire cultural bias that had festered for generations. The defense, led by Ms. Elena Ramirez, a lawyer celebrated for her vigorous commitment to civil rights, attempted to steer the conversation toward the facts. She invoked modern anti-discrimination laws, particularly citing provisions of the Civil Rights Act and subsequent amendments designed to protect individuals from systemic abuse. Her voice was steady and resolute as she argued that the case against Marcus was built not on substance, but on perception. Mrs. Ramirez presented detailed evidence that underscored Marcus's exemplary character, a record of community service, a supportive family structure, and numerous testimonials from neighbors who had known him for years. She questioned the reliability of the circumstantial evidence and highlighted discrepancies in the testimonies. With each piece of contradictory evidence introduced, it became increasingly clear that the prosecution's case was hollow. Yet, the prejudiced undertone in the courtroom remained undiminished. Throughout the trial, I was acutely aware of the broader implications of the proceedings. This was not merely a case of one man's alleged misdeeds. It was a litmus test for our nation's commitment to equality and justice, principles that many had fought for, but which still felt as fragile as glass. Every utterance in the courtroom reverberated with the weight of history, a reminder of countless injustices that had paved the way to this moment. The jury, comprised of men and women from diverse backgrounds, each bringing their own lived experiences and beliefs, bore the heavy task of sifting through testimony that was inevitably marred by implicit bias. I could see the furrowed brows and hesitations as they grappled with the conflicting narratives presented before them. It was painfully evident how difficult it was for each juror to remain completely objective, as deep-seated stereotypes and societal conditioning competed relentlessly with the rational analysis of evidence. With every passing day, I could feel the collective pressure mounting, not just to reach a verdict, but to deliver a judgment that could either uphold or undermine the very fabric of our democratic ideals. As the trial stretched on over several tense days, the courthouse became a battleground between the forces of hope and despair. On one side were those who insisted on a rigid interpretation of the law, a law increasingly out of sync with the modern understanding of equality. On the other, advocates for civil rights who demanded that the system recognize the inherent dignity of every individual. Each argument presented in that courtroom resonated with the broader struggle for justice that had been fought on the streets, in schools, and in countless other institutions across the country. During a recess, I found myself in a hushed conversation with a local scholar, Dr. Amelia Carter, a professor of sociology specialized in racial inequalities within the judicial system. She explained that Marcus's trial was emblematic of what many scholars called systemic racism. The biases in the legal process, she said, were not isolated incidents, but manifestations of historical prejudice. Modern laws, while robust on paper, could not fully counteract centuries of ingrained societal stereotypes. Her words were a stark reminder of the uphill battle that activists and reformers had waged for decades. Inside the courtroom, every detail mattered. I noticed the subtle shifts in tone when evidence was discussed that touched on Marcus's character. His deep religious faith, his commitment to mentorship programs, and even his modest attire, which was unfairly interpreted as a sign of defiance rather than humility. Each overlooked detail was a silent protest against the toxic force of bias. The defense's strategy was not just to dismantle the prosecution's evidence, but to expose that very bias. They highlighted procedural missteps that, although irrelevant on paper, pointed to a broader pattern of disregarding due process when it came to black citizens. The testimony regarding the events leading up to the chaotic incident was a narrative formed under the pressure of collective assumptions. Witnesses hesitated to contradict the opinion of their peers, a form of social conformity that further complicated the picture of justice. I listened with a mixture of frustration and sorrow as voices that should have been neutral became colored by moral panic and historical suspicion. These were not isolated errors in judgment. They were symptomatic of a deeply flawed system that allowed the prejudices of the past to dictate the course of modern legal outcomes. Indeed, the trial underscored an unsettling reality. Change in the law did not automatically translate into change in behavior. Despite the existence and enforcement of robust anti-discrimination policies, humanity's predisposition to judge by appearances remained a potent force. Even as modern technology and increased transparency promised to usher in a new era of accountability, the human factor, bias, continued to skew justice. I could feel it in the tone of each witness, in the rigid inflections of the prosecutor, and in the cautious yet impassioned rebuttals from the defense. One of the most distressing moments came when the judge, a seasoned magistrate with decades of experience, inadvertently allowed a prejudiced remark to slip from his lips during a procedural discussion. It was a moment that paused the room, an unintentional flash of bias that reverberated through the hearts of those present. The defense immediately objected, citing the anti-discrimination statutes that underlined every aspect of American jurisprudence. The brief interruption highlighted a critical paradox. Even those charged with upholding the law could not fully escape the influence of societal prejudices. As I sat through each day of the trial, the atmosphere was a complex weave of determined hope, entrenched bias, and an ever-looming sense of historic injustice. The courtroom was no longer just a space where legal arguments were presented. It became a stage where the struggle for racial equality was performed in subtle yet powerful acts. Every piece of evidence, every remark made, and every pause fraught with tension contributed to a larger narrative about the state of our justice system. In a poignant testimony, one elderly community member took the floor, her voice trembling as she recounted her own experiences with discrimination. Her story, though personal and fraught with decades of hardship, resonated with a universal truth. The law must be blind to skin color, yet as she noted, the eyes behind the law are not always so. Her words lingered in the room like an elegy to a lost era of equality. A reminder that the system, though reformed in many ways, still bore the scars of a painful past. It was in those moments, the collective sighs after a particularly charged testimony, the whispered conversations during recess, and the silent exchanges of empathy between strangers, that I recognized the vital role of every individual in challenging the biases of the system. Despite the determination of the defense and the rigor of modern anti-discrimination laws, the trial itself was a microcosm of an ongoing struggle, a battle for dignity, truth, and fairness against a relentless tide of prejudice. The day of final judgment arrived with an air of grim inevitability. The courthouse, bathed in the soft light of an autumn afternoon, seemed to hold its breath as the jury filed back into the courtroom. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation and anxiety, a tension that resonated with every person present, from the anxious family members in the gallery to the impassive faces of the legal professionals seated in rows. The final moments of the trial were a test of the very principles upon which our justice system was founded. As the jury prepared to announce their decision, I could feel an overwhelming mix of hope and dread. For many in the room, this was more than just a verdict on Marcus's fate. It was a broader judgment on whether the law had prevailed over prejudice, whether justice could ever be truly blind in an era haunted by the ghosts of racism. The jury foreman rose slowly, and in a measured tone that belied the gravity of his words, began to speak. It was an agonizing wait as he recounted the deliberations and the conflicting pieces of evidence. Every sentence was laden with caution, as if the very act of pronouncing the verdict might set in motion events that could either heal or further divide a community already fractured by years of injustice. I listened intently, every fiber of my being attuned to this moment that would echo throughout the corridors of our legal system. After what seemed like an eternity, the foreman concluded, the verdict was guilty. The words reverberated through the silent courtroom like a death knell, a moment when hope gave way to despair. Yet even in this seemingly conclusive moment, the judge called for a brief recess to consider mitigating factors before delivering the final sentence. This interim period was crucial. It was a final opportunity for the voices of justice and equality to be heard amid the overarching narrative of bias. When proceedings resumed, the judge, whose earlier lapse with prejudicial remarks had not been forgotten by those present, delivered a speech on the importance of fairness and the sacred duty of the justice system. In his address, he acknowledged the challenges of eliminating the human bias that still colored our legal processes, and he invoked the language of modern anti-discrimination laws that are designed to protect every citizen from unjust treatment. However, he also cautioned that acknowledging these issues was only the first step, a step in a long journey toward realizable equality. As the judge pronounced the final sentence, the courtroom became a silent arena of conflicting emotions. On one side, the prosecution and those who had long subscribed to a narrative of inherent guilt in minority communities felt vindicated. On the other, the defense, the supporters of Marcus, and members of the audience who believed in justice and equality felt the sting of a verdict that appeared to be tainted by a pervasive legacy of prejudice. I felt a deep personal sense of sorrow, the sorrow of witnessing a remarkable man whose life had been dedicated to his community and family become the symbol of a judicial system unwilling to see past the color of his skin. The final judgment was not just a legal sentence, it was a societal statement that echoed the enduring impact of systemic racism. An entire courtroom had been complicit, knowingly or unknowingly, in a decision that seemed preordained by the prejudices of those in power. In the days that followed, the verdict sparked widespread debate within the community. Street protests emerged outside the courthouse, and social media platforms buzzed with calls for reform and accountability in the legal system. Civic leaders and activists, inspired by an unwavering commitment to justice, rallied behind Marcus's family, arguing that the verdict was a stark reminder of the unfinished work in the fight against racial injustice. Legal experts began to dissect the trial, pointing out the numerous procedural irregularities and the subtle yet unmistakable presence of racial bias at every stage. They cited recent amendments to anti-discrimination laws intended to safeguard not only the rights of citizens in theory, but also in practice. Yet their analyses brought forth the uncomfortable reality that laws alone could not eradicate the ingrained prejudices of a society that had long harbored biases against Black individuals. In my final reflection on the case, I could not help but feel that Marcus's trial had become more than a legal proceeding. It had become a symbol of the systemic injustices that continue to plague modern society. The trial was a somber reminder that while progress has been made through landmark legislation and persistent advocacy, the real challenge lies in challenging the human prejudices that persist in even the most structured institutions. The final judgment, delivered in a solemn tone, encapsulated a dual message: an acknowledgement of the law's commitment to order and fairness, and, simultaneously, a subtle admission that the machinery of justice could still be undermined by the biases of those who operated it. It was a verdict that resonated far beyond the confines of the courtroom, forcing every onlooker, including myself, to confront the uncomfortable truth about our collective failure to achieve true equality. As I walked away from the courthouse that day, a heavy feeling settled in my chest, a mix of despair at how far we still have to go, and a faint, persistent hope that one day, by shining a light on these injustices, society might come to terms with its past and pave the way for a genuinely fair future. Marcus's fate was not only his own, it was a mirror reflecting the struggles of countless others, an emblem of unaddressed bias in modern legal practice. I later learned that, following the public outcry, appeals were filed on the basis of procedural injustices and the undeniable influence of racial prejudice. His case became a landmark in the ongoing discussion about systemic racism and had a lasting impact on legal reforms aimed at safeguarding against similar biases. Scholars and activists often refer to this case as a turning point, a painful but necessary catalyst for change in the judicial system. In the end, Marcus's trial served as a poignant testimony to the fact that legal equality cannot be fully realized without addressing the societal prejudices that continue to influence human judgment. It was a story etched in the annals of our city's history, a reminder that while laws are written to be impartial, the hearts and minds of those who enforce them are all too human and sometimes, tragically, fall prey to old prejudices. My account today stands not only as a chronicle of injustice, but as a call to action, an earnest invitation to examine, reflect, and demand that our society, our justice system, and our collective conscience evolve. We must remember that each verdict, each trial, is a step in the long march towards genuine equality, a path that requires relentless vigilance, empathy, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. Marcus Jefferson, the man at the center of this trial, left behind a legacy that was both tragic and inspiring. His life and the events of that fateful trial have sparked conversations, ignited protests, and forced legal institutions to reckon with the persistent shadow of racial bias. I, as a witness, feel it is my duty to ensure that his story, and the lessons it carries, remains a permanent reminder of the work that must be done. Only by acknowledging our collective failures and striving for reform in every corner of our society can we hope to transform our legal system into a beacon of true justice and equality. It is my sincere hope that future generations will learn from this painful chapter in history, that one day the courtroom will no longer serve as a stage for implicit prejudice, but as an arena where every citizen is valued solely for who they are, not the color of their skin. Until that day, Marcus's story, witnessed so vividly by those of us who sought truth in the midst of darkness, will remain an enduring testament to the urgent need for change in our modern society. In a world that continues to wrestle with the remnants of old injustices, may we all commit ourselves to the pursuit of reform, mindful that the fight against systemic racism is as much about the hearts and minds of individuals as it is about the pages of our laws. Marcus's case will serve as a clarion call, a reminder that justice must be more than a lofty ideal. It must be a lived reality, celebrated and protected by every voice in society. Thus, as I close this account, I remember that moment in the gallery, the sound of the gavel and the silence that followed. It was a silence fraught with the weight of unspoken truths and the promise of a future where no one, regardless of their race, will have to endure such injustice. The echoes of that trial continue to shape the discourse on equality, and it is my deepest aspiration that this story inspires others to challenge prejudice wherever it lurks, and to demand that our system of justice be truly just for all. This is my story, a chronicle of one trial, one verdict, and the enduring call to fight for the fundamental rights that bind us as a nation. May it serve as a reminder that while the journey to justice is fraught with setbacks and systemic challenges, each step forward is a victory for truth, dignity, and the inherent value of every human being. In the modern labyrinth of law and societal norms, Marcus Jefferson's case remains a landmark event, a critical juncture in our collective struggle for a better, fairer world. It is a clarion call to remind us that every courtroom decision, every legal precedent, must be scrutinized through the lens of equality. Only then can we ensure that future generations inherit a legal system that is truly reflective of the values of justice, fairness, and respect for all individuals, irrespective of race. May this account, born out of my own experience and relentless observation, serve as an enduring beacon to those who strive to dismantle the remnants of racial bias from our institutions. Let it remind us that the road to equality is long and arduous, but with unwavering commitment and collective will, the promise of a just society will one day be realized. As the weeks turned into months, the repercussions of Marcus Jefferson's trial continued to resonate far beyond the confines of that solemn courtroom. Communities across the nation began to rally together, igniting movements and campaigns aimed at addressing the systemic issues that had been laid bare by the verdict. Local organizations emerged, inspired by Marcus's story, to foster dialogue among residents about race, justice, and systemic discrimination. Town halls began filling up with attendees eager to share their experiences and engage in difficult conversations that had long been avoided. In academic institutions, students and professors launched initiatives to study the case in detail. Debates erupted in classrooms, where young minds dissected not only the judicial processes, but also the social constructs that perpetuated inequality. Marcus's trial became a prominent case study in law schools, inspiring future lawyers to prioritize equity and justice in their practices. The discourse surrounding his trial prompted the introduction of new courses focusing on racial bias and justice reform, ensuring that future generations of legal professionals would be trained to recognize and combat systemic issues. At the same time, Marcus's family, buoyed by the support of local activists, sought civil remedies in light of the trial's procedural failures. They became advocates for legislative change, urging lawmakers to enact policies that would monitor and evaluate the practices of law enforcement and judicial systems, aimed at increasing transparency and accountability. Their perseverance laid the groundwork for new bills that focused on de-escalation training for police, restricted the use of profiling tactics, and mandated bias training across all levels of law enforcement. In parallel, media narratives began shifting, as journalists sought to uncover deeper stories that highlighted the impact of systemic racism on families and communities. Documentaries were produced and articles written, ensuring that the story of Marcus not only honored his legacy, but also served as a vital source for advocacy and education. Through art and storytelling, the effects of bias were made visceral. The human experiences behind legal terms began to resonate with a broader audience. In a poignant twist, a prominent actor and activist, moved by the injustice enveloping Marcus's narrative, began producing a film based on his life. This project aimed to elevate personal stories of those who face similar battles against a biased system, bringing fresh attention to the struggles of marginalized individuals. The film, which raised crowdfunding to empower community organizations, sought to captivate audiences in a format that could blend education and empathy, further catalyzing current discussions around justice reform. As these movements gained traction, government institutions began to feel the pressure, and whispers of desiring a comprehensive review of the judicial processes became louder. Initiatives sprang forth focused on removing mandatory minimum sentences for nonviolent offenses, while local municipalities invested in community-based programs addressing underlying issues such as poverty and lack of access to education. The public's eye was turned toward the past mistakes as new policies began shaping a future where fairness was not a mere ideal, but a practice rooted deeply within the frameworks of governance. All the while, those who had stood vigil at the courthouse that fateful day found strength in solidarity. They began organizing regular meetups, a gathering meant to fortify community resilience against continued injustices. These grassroots movements fostered a sense of belonging among individuals who felt isolated in their grief or outrage, weaving a network of support that transcended the fractures created by systemic privilege. Many found their voices amplified within this supportive environment, bringing forth new ideas about how to advocate for change within their neighborhoods and beyond. As the momentum built, I reflected often on that pivotal moment in the courtroom and the subsequent fallout. I came to appreciate the bittersweet nature of Marcus's legacy, a legacy forged through pain, yet filled with ignited hope. It had taken a grievous injustice for so many to awaken to the responsibilities they bore as members of a society. The trial had, unwittingly, marked the beginning of a movement, transforming despair into determination. I held firm to the belief that through collective action and sustained effort, we could steer the course of the future toward a more just society. In remembering Marcus, it became crucial not only to honor his story, but also to recognize the shared humanity that connected us all. His life and the struggles that ensued had become testaments to both the fragility and resilience of our pursuit for justice. It was a journey that painted a complex picture of reality, a world where the narratives of individuals like Marcus must continue to shape the discourse on equality, challenging each of us to rethink our roles in fostering a fairer society. I remain resolute in my mission to amplify these voices, to keep the conversation alive, and to fight against the very structures that sought to erase them. The battle for justice is ongoing, and as I forge forward in my advocacy, I find comfort in knowing that this journey will undoubtedly forge new alliances, ignite new passions, and perhaps finally lead us toward the promise of equality for all. Moreover, I am reminded that while the struggle is far from over, it is made vibrant and possible by the courage of those like Marcus, who, even in silence, continue to inspire a generation determined to dismantle the chains of injustice. Through their collective courage, we shall persist and ensure that we do not merely dream of a better world, but that we actively work to create one where justice is not a privilege, but a right extended to every individual, undeterred by the color of their skin.